Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a real joy to be with you at the SmartCommunities Conference and to speak a little bit about how behavioral insight can help to create smart communities. So as I was introduced very kindly, my name is Sam Tatam. I'm Global Consulting Partner for Ogilvy Consulting, but I also run our behavioral science practice. So a specialist team within Ogilvy, a big creative network that's focused on applying behavioral insights to unlock innovative and creative solutions. And this is our team. We are a collection of individuals from an array of different backgrounds, from behavioral economics and behavioral science through to psychologists, social anthropologists, social geographers, people really better understanding people and place. Because people and place and context is so important for why we do what we do. So this conference, this opportunity to speak about how we're applying behavioral science and behavioral insights to come up with innovative solutions for social challenges or community challenges is what I would like to share this afternoon. So one question that we're often asked, why behavioral science? Why are we so passionate about behavioral science and behavioral insights? And when we're faced with this question, we pose this analogy. And in our practice, in our business, we work across marketing departments to health and safety departments and to sort of internal organizational transformation business units. And the analogy is very simple. Until recently, in many of these parts of our professional lives or personal lives, we've been viewing the world through broken binoculars. And the broken binoculars have two fractured lenses. And the first fractured lens on the left-hand side is an assumption that humans are rational, based on a neoclassical model of economics, that humans are rational utility maximizers, that we navigate the world with perfect information and perfect trust, and we only conduct or facilitate or enact in a way that we stand to gain or we stand to benefit. But we know much of our behavior isn't like this. We know, for example, elements like altruistic behavior, where we do people for others, stand against a classical rational model. So we need another way of better understanding why we do what we do. And the second fractured lens on the right-hand side is really around hypothetical decision-making, an assumption that we might be able to ask people or ask citizens how they might respond with a new train, or ask people how they might behave in a slightly different circumstance, or ask people to justify why their behavior occurred in a particular way in the past. A lot of research is telling us that up to 90 to 95% of our daily decisions are actually made in an evolutionary old part of our brain. It's a part of our brain that we say it's opaque to introspection. We can't ask it for the answers because it simply can't tell us. We can't access these drivers that are sort of wired into our evolution that have been really powerful in helping us to survive for so long. These shortcuts, these decision heuristics that exist, sometimes aren't accessible to our conscious brain. So we tend to generate maybe a socially appropriate response based on the circumstance that we're in or the people that we're speaking to, rather than the real driver of human behavior. You can pump the scent of lemon detergent into a cafeteria and give someone a crumbly cookie, and they'll meticulously clean up after themselves because they've been primed with this sense of cleanliness. And again, if we were to ask someone why we thought they behaved in that way, they wouldn't necessarily say it's because of the bucket of lemon detergent in the corner. They simply couldn't access this driver. But experimental psychology and behavioral economics and behavioral science is starting to help us better understand some of the real drivers. We call this in Ogilvy the real why of our behavior. And we like to use this analogy. Let's imagine for a moment that we're on the board for Coca-Cola. And our challenge together is to increase the sales of Coca-Cola. And oftentimes, if we ask people in our workshops how we might increase the sales of Coca-Cola, oftentimes people tell us three things. We might make it cheaper, better value for money. We might make it bigger, again, greater volume for the price, or we might make it taste better or taste different. And and those are sort of three logical, rational responses that we can probably all agree with. But what's been really interesting is the brand that's given Coca-Cola a real sort of run for its money over the best part of a decade. It's a brand like Red Bull. It's half the size, costs twice as much, and certainly when you taste it for the first time, it tastes a bit horrendous. There's something about tasting a little bit bad, a little bit toxic, that reinforces the fact that it must be doing something good for you. And this is an answer that we might not get through our fractured lenses of neoclassical economics and hypothetical decision-making, but we can through behavioural science. So I want to touch on just some examples of how we're starting to apply this within our work, a range from looking at hand hygiene behaviour to eliminate contaminated hands by 63%, working in hospitals to shape the purchasing behaviour of buyers. So a vast array of different categories by which we're deploying some of these insights. But I wanted to focus on three in the time that we have. And the first is looking at how we worked to reduce antisocial behaviour on the streets of London. How do we stem antisocial behaviour on the streets of London? And sometimes, again, if we're to look at our hypothetical sort of decision-making and neoclassical lens of economics, we might say, get more police on the street. Or we might say, increase the fines for people who might be looting and rioting during the London riots back in 2011, 2012. And we found really quite a different insight, a less obvious insight, but a very valuable insight that taps into the round eyes and round faces of babies, that releases a natural oxytocin response to help calm people down to reduce antisocial behaviour. And I've got a quick video that I'd like to play that does a good sort of job of telling the story.
As the London riots of 2011 took hold, people in Greenwich burnt down the pub they drank in and looted the shops where they bought their food. But as the disturbances died down elsewhere, antisocial behaviour in the area continued. Greenwich Council needed to find a way to stop the problem minority from destroying their own community. We believed that the shop shutters that were ripped from their runners were part of the problem. Could we turn the shutters into part of the solution? We wanted to conduct a social experiment. In 2009, a team of scientists from Pennsylvania found proof that the large head, round face and big eyes so beloved of Disney actually motivates caring behaviour in adults. They proved that cute matters to the brain.
If I was in local government, I know it would be a lot easier to say I'm getting more police out there than to say I'm painting a few shutters. And I think we need to work to build confidence that these kind of interventions have their role, that they work and they have their role, and get them taken as seriously as hard interventions which are expensive and in the past have proven not to work.
Could the power of cute minimise antisocial behaviour in Greenwich? After a campaign to recruit babies from the local area and a long night painting, we turned the unused and inhuman metal sheets into giant portraits of Greenwich babies. As the shops shut at night, the metal shutters came down to reveal the babies when they were needed most. It had a powerful effect on the community, with an 18% reduction in crime, and locals who say they feel much safer.
If you've got positive images around, it makes you think positively.
They are amazing.
I think there should be more of it. Yeah, I think it's a good idea, and it looks good.
And it didn't take thousands of pounds or hundreds of police. Just a few cans of paint. The people of Greenwich have shown an overwhelming love for the babies, and the shopkeepers have embraced the idea as their own. Before long, other communities all around the world, from Belfast to the Bronx, were talking about it too. What started as an experiment in London is now being rolled out in Northern Ireland this year. This could be the dawn of a new era in crime prevention.
So we really love this as a lateral example of thinking differently. Of how actually sort of our logical, rational brain might tell us to have more police or increase the fines, but thinking around our wiring as people, right? Exploring this through a behavioural science lens, we open up an entirely new space for innovation that we had before. And in the study, you'll see there that we initially referenced an 18% reduction in crime. At the time, that was a correlational statistic, so we couldn't tell whether or not the police came and sort of took people off the streets midway through. But we've since worked with Oxford University in partnership, and that figure is looking closer to 24% of a reduction in crime that's been sustained over time. Something as simple as faces on a shop front. So hopefully we've sort of opened the mind as to what can be possible in thinking about innovation through a slightly different lens. I want to change tack now from sort of the streets of London or the cityscape to now thinking about safety, and specifically some work where we're tasked with actually preventing injuries in factories. Right? And there are similar insights that are relevant here to prevent injuries on roads for cyclists. This is how we better understand the human condition and build a context to help us be safe. That's fundamentally the challenge. And when we look in safety context, this is a very familiar scene, right? People say it with safety, personal protective equipment, hard hats and glasses. When we spend our time with people in factory work, oftentimes this is long durations of shifts, 12-hour shifts, 4 days a week, sometimes over 30 years doing quite similar work. So it can be quite familiar, quite repetitive work. And what we know the dangers with this from a psychological perspective is that the more familiar we are, sometimes the more prone to risk we are. I think the famous statistic is a third of car accidents occur a mile from your home, right? We sort of become comfortable, we mentally disengage. So elements like this, for example, this is known as the avenue effect. If you see trees planted along a straight, it makes it feel like you're actually driving a little bit faster. They used this same strategy in Chicago. They painted a series of white lines on Lakeshore Drive that got closer together the closer you came to the corner. And actually, by making people feel like they were driving faster, you naturally slowed people down. Again, don't tell people to slow down, don't find them. Make them feel like they're driving faster than they are, so they naturally slow down. In the Rio Olympics, the first Olympics to ever actually ban men from wearing the headgear in boxing, they found men were more likely to get a concussion in boxing wearing a headgear than without one, because we actually have a false sense of security. We put ourselves in greater risk, the safer we feel. So if we go back to our factory workers now, and we're actually dressing them for safety every day, are we psychologically setting them up for failure? Is a key question. So our innovative solution was to design a suite of vulnerable personal protective equipment. Personal protective equipment that made people feel a greater risk. It reminded people that they still had fingers inside of these gloves, even though they were familiar, they were using all the time, they were still at risk. And we developed a series of prototypes to work within the factory. But what's important about safety experiments is that thankfully there is a low incidence rate, so we needed to develop a clever survey to better understand its effectiveness. So we asked people about their vulnerability to injury across three conditions. Condition one, just being a bare hand. Condition two, being our vulnerable personal protective equipment with a skeleton. And condition three, being our normal gloves. Across three different styles of use, on a box cutter, on a drop saw that makes it feel a bit nerve-wracking, and a handsaw. Three different conditions of vulnerability. We also asked people to state their level of perceived risk. So how much faster might they be comfortable to have a hammer be hit? Would you feel comfortable having it sped up or slowed down? So this was the experimental paradigm. We found that as people felt more vulnerable, they wanted the hammer to be slowed down. So there was a relationship between risk and vulnerability. But what we found interestingly across our conditions is that there wasn't a difference on the drop saw. The level of perceived vulnerability was the same, which sort of makes sense on a circular saw. We did find a significant increase in vulnerability for wearing without a glove versus our gloved conditions for the handsaw. That shows that the paradigm was working. You're far more vulnerable when you're not wearing a glove than wearing a glove with a handsaw. But interestingly, when we look at the box cutter, the least significant of the tools, we had a 13% increase in perceptions of vulnerability. So simply designing our gloves in a particular way, we boosted the perceived risk. So we had a 13% increase in vulnerability. Now very quickly, before I wrap, I want to touch on just one final piece of how we're looking at behavioral insights to increase social care repayments. How can we increase social debt and social care repayments using behavioral science and psychology? A few different factors that were hard here. It was hard for people to process the information that people were being sent for a bill. There was information overload. There was a lack of perceived consequences that led us to do many different initiatives on the letter drop. But there was one particular piece that I want to dwell on really quickly, as how we might encourage people to sign up for a direct debit for their social care repayments. Right? Rather than sending a check or going into the bank, how do we sign up for a direct debit that does this automatically? And to use this, to drive this, we use the psychology of an asymmetric decoy. Some of us may have seen this experiment looking at The Economist, where they actually, and this is a Daniel Ariely experiment, they had two different conditions for The Economist. One, buying the online subscription at $59, and then buying the print and web subscription for $125. And with those two conditions, they found that a majority of people purchased the subscription only. 68% purchased the subscription only, and 32% bought the more expensive combination. What they then did was add a decoy. They added something of equal price, but less of value. So they added just the print subscription only for $125. So now you could buy the online subscription for $59, print only for $125, or print and web for $125. By adding this decoy, they found that the numbers shift dramatically. Now, because of that relevance, 84% of people were more comfortable spending a greater degree of money because of the decoy. So we use this very simply. We framed the difficulty of the payment solutions in a way that suggested recommended direct debits. We made a decoy. Direct debits was 5 minutes. It's on a difficulty level of 1, whereas the other components were far more difficult. So we framed them relatively. And we had a 61% increase in direct debit signups, just using something quite simple. So I've gone through a few different cases there, and I'm conscious, slightly quick towards the end, and I hope the language barrier hasn't been huge. But really excited here to share how behavioral science is arming us with some powerful insights to innovate in different ways, to use behavioral insights to create smart communities in the way we interact with each other and design our world. So many thanks for your time and having me on board. This is my details, samtatum@ogilvy.com. If you have any questions or follow-up requests, and my Twitter handle is there also. So really pleased to be able to join you. And I don't think we have time for questions, but more than happy to if that's the case.